Merely 4 kilometers beneath the surface of Antarctica, under a ceiling of ice thicker than 12 Empire State Buildings stacked end to end, there is a lake the size of Lake Ontario. No sunlight has touched its surface in an estimated 15 to 25 million years. Russian scientists confirmed its existence using radar in 1996, but it took another 16 years of drilling before anyone actually reached it. When they finally broke through, in February of 2012, they found water that had been completely sealed off from the atmosphere since before the first ice sheets locked down the continent. What follows is a count of 8 facts, each one stranger than the last, building toward the single detail that made scientists start comparing this lake, seriously, not poetically, to the ocean hiding under the ice of a moon of Jupiter. Here's what we actually know about how this began. Lake Vostok sits beneath Vostok Station, the Russian research outpost that also holds the record for the coldest naturally occurring temperature ever measured on Earth, negative 89.2 degrees Celsius, recorded in 1983. Researchers had been drilling an ice core at that station since the 1970s, mostly to study ancient climate data trapped in the ice layers. It was only in the 1990s, using ice-penetrating radar, that a British and Russian survey team realized there was liquid water underneath them the entire time, roughly 250 kilometers long and up to 50 kilometers wide, sitting in a rift valley carved into the Antarctic bedrock. That's where the documented trail gets complicated. Once scientists knew a body of liquid water that size existed under the ice, they faced a problem. Competitor explanations tend to skip past entirely. How do you physically sample a lake that has been chemically and biologically isolated for millions of years without contaminating it with whatever you drilled the hole with? The Russian team was using tens of thousands of liters of kerosene and Freon as drilling fluid to keep the borehole from refreezing under that much pressure. Every liter of that fluid was a potential source of surface bacteria that could contaminate the very sample they were trying to keep pristine. This is where a fair number of people reasonably start arguing. Some scientists outside the Russian program argued the entire extraction method was too risky and too contaminated to ever produce clean data. That drilling into an untouched ancient ecosystem with petroleum-based fluid was, scientifically speaking, close to negligent. Others countered that the alternative, leaving the lake permanently unsampled, meant giving up one of the only direct windows into how life might survive in total isolation. That disagreement was never fully resolved, and it's worth sitting with. Was reaching Lake Vostok in 2012 a triumph of persistence, or a compromised experiment that muddied its own results before they were even collected? That's a fair fight to have in the comments.
We have a good sample here.
Here's the detail that doesn't fit the simple picture of just an isolated lake.
Matching the previous entry.
The water under the ice is not simply cold and still. Because of the immense weight of nearly 4 kilometers of ice pressing down, the water at the lake's surface sits under a pressure of roughly 350 to 400 times normal atmospheric pressure. Under that pressure, water can remain liquid at temperatures that would freeze it solid anywhere else. Researchers estimate parts of the lake hover around 3 degrees below 0 Celsius and still stay liquid. The lake is also fed by geothermal heat rising from the bedrock beneath it, which is part of what keeps it from freezing solid despite the extreme cold above. Officially, the explanation for how the drilling team avoided contamination is straightforward. On May 26, 2012, the Russian team stopped drilling roughly meters above the calculated boundary of the lake and let pressure from below push water up into the borehole rather than pushing kerosene down into the lake. When that water refroze at the bottom of the ice sheet, it formed a plug of frozen lake water that researchers later drilled out and analyzed directly, without ever mechanically breaking the lake's own physical seal. The problem is, some drilling fluids still made contact with lake water during the initial breakthrough, and separating what came from the lake versus what came from the borehole has remained a genuine analytical headache ever since. Now here's the part that made headlines. And it's also the moment worth pausing on if lakes sealed for millions of years under a mile of frozen darkness are the kind of thing you find interesting. Because this is exactly the sort of documented anomaly this channel exists to dig into, and there's a lot more like it if you decide to stick around. When Russian researchers at the St. Petersburg-based Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute led by biologist Sergey Bulat, sequenced DNA recovered from the refrozen accretion ice in 2013. They identified genetic material corresponding to more than 3,500 distinct sequences. The overwhelming majority were bacterial, but a smaller fraction of those sequences appeared to match multicellular organisms, including material resembling fungi and even, according to some interpretations of the data, traces consistent with more complex life such as mollusks or arthropods. No one disputes the first part. It's the second part that causes the argument. Nobody seriously disputes that bacterial life of some kind likely exists in Lake Vostok. Extremophile microbes have been documented surviving in far harsher conditions elsewhere on Earth, from hydrothermal vents to deep permafrost. What remains genuinely unresolved is whether the more complex genetic signals detected in that 2013 sample came from anything that actually lives in the lake, or whether they were contamination from drilling equipment, laboratory handling, or even the researchers themselves. Independent labs that later reviewed the data were split, and as of now, there is no scientific consensus on which explanation is correct. What the data doesn't explain is how anything, even simple bacteria, would generate enough energy to survive down there in the first place. A stable ecosystem generally needs an energy source. For surface life, that's sunlight. For deep ocean vents, it's chemical energy from the vent itself. Lake Vostok has no vents that have been confirmed, no sunlight, and extremely limited nutrient input, since it has been sealed off from the outside world for longer than most terrestrial mammal species have existed. Researchers have not fully explained where a self-sustaining microbial population, if one exists, would be getting the chemical energy required to survive across geological timescales. That question has not been answered, and it may not be answerable until a cleaner, less contaminated sample is recovered. This is where most explanations quietly stop, but the strongest fact is still ahead. Lake Vostok has become the closest terrestrial comparison scientists have for the subsurface ocean believed to exist beneath the icy crust of Europa, one of Jupiter's moons. Europa's ice shell is estimated to be many kilometers thick, sitting atop a global ocean kept liquid not by geothermal heat from below in the way Vostok is, but primarily by tidal flexing caused by Jupiter's gravity. NASA and the European Space Agency have both cited Lake Vostok specifically in mission planning documents for Europa exploration as a rehearsal environment for the central unsolved problem of the mission. How do you drop equipment through kilometers of ice and sample an ocean that has been completely isolated from sunlight without contaminating the very sample you're trying to study? The engineering problem Russian scientists faced at Vostok Station is, in miniature, the same problem awaiting any future mission to Europa, except at Europa, the isolation hasn't lasted 15 million years. It has, by most estimates, lasted since the moon itself formed. That's the detail that turns this from a story about an unusual Antarctic lake into something closer to a rehearsal for finding life somewhere other than Earth. Not because anyone has confirmed alien life exists at either location. Nobody has, and this channel isn't going to pretend otherwise. But because the technical and biological puzzle is functionally the same puzzle. Sealed liquid water, total darkness, extreme pressure, and an open question about whether isolation that complete can still sustain something alive. So where does that leave things, honestly? Nearly 4 kilometers of ice still separate us from that lake the size of Lake Ontario, exactly as it did before drilling ever began. That image from the opening hasn't changed, and neither has the basic mystery underneath it. What's proven is straightforward. Lake Vostok is real. It has been liquid and sealed off from the atmosphere for millions of years, and Russian researchers did successfully recover frozen samples of its water in 2012 and 2013. What's genuinely unresolved is almost everything downstream of that fact. Whether the complex genetic material found in those samples came from the lake or from contamination, how any organism there would generate the energy to survive, and whether an ecosystem has been quietly running its own separate, isolated experiment in survival since long before humans existed to wonder about it. Researchers have proposed cleaner drilling methods for future sampling attempts, ones that would avoid kerosene and Freon entirely. But as of now, no second, less contaminated expedition to the lake's open water has been completed. Until one is. The honest answer to what is actually alive down there, sealed under all that ice and all that pressure, is the same answer scientists gave more than a decade ago. We don't fully know, and we haven't ruled it out either. Whatever has been surviving in that darkness, if anything has, it's been doing so since long before there was anyone up here to ask the question.